Wow. Um, so I wanted to go live mainly because I don't like editing. So I go live because I can just talk and then post it, and people can watch it after the fact. But I've done one video on the topic of classism or elitism in the horse world, and I wanted to expand on those thoughts. So that's what I wanted to go live to do, is to just talk a little bit more about that, because I've noticed a lot of people participating in a elitist mindset, whether they are aware of that or not. My dog is barking. But I think that pointing it out and talking about why these attitudes are elitist will help some people who are willing to reflect understand what it is that they're supporting and what it is that they're doing, because there is truly so much of this in the horse world. And I think the first step to recognizing it is realizing that the horse world has like a disproportionate amount of people who are in the upper class financially compared to other sports. It's not as accessible. It's very expensive to stay in the sport, and competition is exorbitantly expensive with very little payoff. Because especially in English sports, you're not really making money by competing until you're competing at like the pinnacle of the sport, and even then, the amount of money you have to put in to get to that level often isn't going to be paying you back unless you've been competing as a professional and having other people pay your fees the entire time, which most people don't start out doing that. So it favors people who have the capacity to spend money. So the first thing that I want to bring up is the cost of like a rated show in like the hunter jumper world. If you want to go compete at Thunderbird for a week, at like at the absolute lowest, including stabling, you're probably looking at like the absolute lowest, and this is an underestimation, probably $1,000 to compete for 1 week, and that is some people's rent. So to have that much extra money to go and pay to attend a show that you might not make any money at, and that you probably won't even make a fraction of what you put in if you do make money, you have to be in a financial position where you're able to do that. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've gotten like a pretty interesting response to the video that I posted about Banksy, my young horse that I bred to show jump with and to compete with eventually. Um, and there's a lot of people saying that I should just join the competition industry to show people the right way to do it. And to the point where some people are actually being quite rude about it. They're saying that if I really cared, I would get in there and I would show people the better way of doing things. And that attitude fails to consider the cost and how prohibitive the cost of showing is, without even factoring in the environment and the fact that people don't have to want to put themselves in an environment that might be unhealthy for them just to prove something to people. But the cost is a huge thing. Like spending $1,000 minimum to go compete when I don't want to is insane. That is insane. That's not reasonable. And having the capacity to do so puts you in a level of privilege that a lot of people do not have. Like $1,000 is more than half of what I pay for rent each month, and it could go pretty far in a lot of other directions. Um, so seeing this type of response has honestly made me pretty uncomfortable, because it just shows a lack of awareness in the horse world. It shows that people don't even recognize where they're privileged, and they're either not considering it because they've never been exposed to the idea of like how much these things cost, or they're just simply completely unaware of how much everything costs. Um, but a lot of the horse world is built on elitism and classism. Like if you look at how people talk about horse welfare when the horse is in a high class situation versus how they will talk about a horse when they are in a low class situation where they're not at as fancy of a barn, they're not getting fancy treatments. It's way, way different. people assume that upper level show horses are automatically treated better and getting the best of the best care because they have fancy barns, they get special treatments like chiro massage, they might stand under a solarium, they might get like to see a vet all the time, and they view those as indicators that the horse is being better cared for. But if you actually break it down and you look at what people are putting money into for these upper level show horses, the vast majority of it, while on paper it could look like it's for the best interest of the horse, it's largely for the rider. Like massage and like physio and all of these types of treatments are to keep the horse sound for competition. Seeing the vet all the time, one, red flag, because why is the horse lame that much? But again, it's to keep the horse in competition. And then when you actually break down whether or not the horse is having their basic needs met, a lot of horses who are competing at the upper levels don't have enough turnout. They don't get any social opportunities, and they're moved around a lot. Like if we even just looking at the sheer amount of travel that these upper level horses are having to do in order to compete, it's really hard to argue the ethics of taking a herd animal and flying them around the world and taking them to stressful environment after stressful environment. The fact that the horses tolerate that without completely losing their minds, most of them, doesn't mean that it's good for them. It's not in their best interest. There's no argument to try to justify that that's the best case scenario care for them. And no amount of physio, chiro, massages, expensive treatments, solariums, massage blankets, special treatments of any sort, no amount of special treatments will cancel out the fact that removing a grazing herd animal from their comfortable environment and taking them all around the world, flying them all around the world from place to place to place is not in their best interest. And these horses never get to establish healthy bonds for the most part. They don't get to build friendships with other horses. They don't get to have a herd. They don't get to have these regular things that horses as herd animals and as social animals really should have. On top of that, kind of circling back to what I was saying about people saying that I should compete to show people the right way to do things and the ethical way of doing things and that it's possible. There's been competitors for years that have been doing exactly that, and it hasn't changed anything because at its core, what is being rewarded in competition is who has the most money, who's the most willing to push for results, and who just dedicates their time and their money to competition fully. It's not really about ethics, especially in the show jumping ring. If you slap your like a harsh bit on a really talented horse that's running like a freight train through the bridle, you can win a lot of stuff. And you can do really well in the show ring, but it's not necessarily in the horse's best interest. There are a lot of people who ride softly and have less harsh equipment, but they're not typically the ones getting the most limelight, and they already exist and they have for years, and it hasn't made a difference. And trying to degrade the issue to just being like, oh, we just need more good examples, fails to recognize the systemic issue that creates the abuse in the first place. And once again, it comes back to classism and elitism, because when we look at these upper level competitors, their treatment of horses is excused on the basis of these horses get the best of the best care. They get the most expensive care, even when there's a lack of examples of these horses getting their actual needs met. People are way more likely to defend the shiny competition horse with the beautiful clipped coat in the beautiful stall with wrought iron fixings and like this barn that has chandeliers in it and all these expensive treatments the horse gets. They're more likely to defend the welfare of that horse than they are a horse that's living outside in a field with just a shelter to go into, even though the horse in the field with the herd is probably having more of their needs met than the average show horse. And that comes down to classism because it's just appearances. The appearance of having more money to put into something is viewed as a better standard of care, even when, if you're looking on paper, these horses' needs aren't being met. And I see it consistently throughout the horse world. People will be more comfortable seeing these horses in tiny little paddocks and like just being in a stall most of their time than they are watching horses in fields with like portable electric fencing and just less shiny and expensive products containing these horses, even though their needs are more met. And it is classist. So I think I have a little bit of a unique perspective on competition and showing because when I first started riding and I was growing up, my family did have a lot of money, like a significant amount of money where like I didn't realize it because I was literally like 4 years old. I had a lot of money put into competition and being able to ride and getting lessons, and I didn't realize how fortunate I was until we lost all of that. And I like my dad had a stroke when I was 8, and then my uncle embezzled like all of my family's savings, so we lost everything. And I went from having like full board in a horse show barn to needing to move my horse to a backyard barn that was cheaper. And the backyard barn had a way higher standard of care in terms of what horses needed. And the change in his behavior was so clear and so phenomenal that I could no longer look away and stick my head in the sand and defend these types of things. So I've been on both sides of the coin where I've had easy access to the expenses of competition versus having to actually work for it. And the sheer expense of existing in competition, because also what I said about it costing like a minimum of $1,000 per week of showing to do a rated show in the hunter jumper world, that's like at the absolute lowest end, and that's also not factoring in needing to take time off work. So the few times I was competing, when I was paying for myself and when I did a couple of rated shows a few years ago, I was having to get up at like 4 a.m., go and work first and get all of my work done because I could not afford to take time off work, and then go and spend an entire day at a show. And that is also prohibitive to wanting to compete because it is so much work. It is so much physical labor. And a lot of these people making these judgments either do not own their own horses, or if they do, they probably have them on full board. So they're not doing the daily care of their horses. They're not having to feed. They're not having to pick out the paddocks, rain or shine. They're not having to check waters and go do all of these heavy labor things that are required to maintain horses if you're not paying someone else to do these things. So they don't have the same concept of reality. And then this also goes back to what I was saying about elitism and classism. And this is not a dig at people who full board their horses, but it's just a reality of the situation. And I say this as someone who used to, like, I still to this day, I've had horses on full board for longer than I have done self-care for. But when you're full boarding your horse and you're only going into the barn to ride them, essentially, that's the main priority every time you go to the barn, you don't have a realistic view of how your horse is actually living because you're only there to ride them. You pull them out of their paddock or their stall and you ride them and you leave, and you don't have to worry about any of the care. And I think this is also why a lot of people who do this type of care are so comfortable just ignoring the reality of their horse's situation if their horse is stabled for 20 plus hours a day, because they're not actually standing out there seeing how their horse lives. A lot of their time at the barn is spent just riding and using the horse for their desires. They're not spending time watching what their horse does and seeing what they do for hours at a time. I think that if we set up cameras in the stalls of chronically stabled horses and just time lapse what their day looks like, a lot of people would have a different perspective on stalling horses excessively, because it would be very hard to justify it when you actually see how bored and terrible their life looks. But when we have these people on full board that aren't actually seeing what their horses are doing all the time and are so far removed from that lifestyle that they don't see it, like you don't see, you're less likely to see how stressed your horse is at feed time. You're less likely to see their antics when they're coming in and out. You're less likely to see what they're doing and how bored they look when they're standing in these small areas. You're less likely to see them trying to interact with other horses and being unable to. And like, even before I went on completely self-care, I started working at barns and I noticed these things. And the level of stress in the average stall to paddock horse's life is extreme. They are way less relaxed than horses who are living in herds. And it's abundantly clear when you immerse yourself in these environments. So the other thing about this classism and elitism in the horse world is I think that if a lot of people who are in the upper class of horses and who dedicate their lives to competing and showing actually were directly involved in the day-to-day care of their horses, they wouldn't be able to justify the practices that they do, because they would be seeing the stress and the discomfort and the boredom in their horses. And they'd be seeing it a lot more clearly in a way that it's harder to ignore. And it would also take time out of their day where they don't have the same capacity to just go ride, go home, and like work on showing and dedicating their time towards that. Because for me, like the other day, I threw 80 bales of hay. 80 bales of hay at like minimum 50 pounds per bale to stack hay and go get hay for my horses. I had to go drive to pick it up. I had to stack it in the trailer, and then I had to unload it and stack it in the hayloft. People on full board don't have to do that. So these are the things where I find it really hard to listen to people who are saying things where they're oversimplifying the amount of work involved with horses and how easy and accessible it is to do these things, because they don't actually understand. And with myself in particular, like one of the reasons why I don't want to go into competition at this time and why I've been really turned off towards it is because of the amount of pressure involved. And most people on the video that I posted talking about this were very supportive and understanding, but there was still comments that were putting a lot of pressure on and essentially saying, hey, like, degrade your own mental health well-being and deplete your bank account to prove something to other people and to show them that there's a better way of doing things, as if showing is necessary for that, because you can film videos and you can post online and you can educate people and do clinics all without competing. For me personally, I think I have more value outside of the show ring and spending my time teaching clinics and helping educate people on horse behavior and clicker training than I do going into competition. And realistically, it is actually choosing one or the other for the most part because of how much work I'm already doing. I don't think people realize how much time it takes to actually care for horses day to day and also like run and maintain a business. Like it is very overwhelming, and I've been burnt out for years. And I've been trying to recover from burnout for years, but I haven't been able to take a break from what I'm doing because these things, they always need to be done. And it's a privilege to be able to just offload that work onto other people. And like having horses live on my property is great. I wouldn't change it for the world. If I had to go back to full board, I don't think I'd want to have horses anymore because a lot of the full board facilities in my area don't provide sufficient care for horses. So that's not like a complaint, but it's just a reality of the situation. And the level of pressure that is being applied to me by select people because of what I've said about showing is exactly why I don't want to be in that environment, because even in the absence of wanting to do that, I'm still having people try to get at me and say that I need to do it. And I don't like that. Like I really am resistant to people trying to pressure me into doing things that I don't want to do. It makes me want to do them a lot less. And I've become a better horse person since I've removed those pressures from my life. And I think that putting myself back into that environment would not only impact my mental health, but it would also impact my horsemanship, because there would be sacrifices that would need to be made in order to make those things possible for me, that I don't really want to make. So this whole thing, like, I think that a lot of horse people need a serious reality check on the level of privilege that they possess, because they're surrounded by so many people that have similar access to things or even more, and then they don't recognize the fact that they're as privileged as they are, because like even just on its own, the sheer expense of showing in sanctioned shows should be enough to tell people that it's not accessible. Anyone who can pay like $1,000 to like well over that each month to show is doing well enough that they can justify putting that expense just to go and compete and likely get nothing in return. And we have people who are doing that for several weeks of the month and spending like upwards of $8,000 to $10,000 competing. That is insane. That's more than a lot of people make in a month, and it's just being put into showing. That's not including their lessons. It's not including travel to the show. It's not including paying their horse's board. It's not including all of their other life expenses. If people can put that into competition, they are very, very privileged. And this isn't privilege doesn't mean that you don't work hard. But it means that there are challenges that you do not have to consider that other people face, because ultimately, if you have that amount of money to put into competition, you're doing well enough that you can justify spending it and getting very little in return, because it's not an investment in the sense that if you pay it, that you're likely to make back more than that. Generally speaking, you're not, because there's very little money to be won in English horse sports, especially. And I hate people skirting over that issue and not talking about it more, because like it's just not realistic. And like I just think that this fixation on competition as a means of changing horsemanship is flawed, because the system is what created a lot of the abuse in the first place. The system is what created a lot of the issues in the first place, and like the desire to compete and win has created a lot of corruption. And ignoring the impact that that has on how people respond to horses and what they view to be normal isn't going to help the situation. And also ignoring how people are rewarded for bad horsemanship isn't going to help the issue. Also, spending money to support these organizations that are enabling poor treatment of horses, I don't really think is morally superior at all. But at its core, like I think my biggest issue is that this level of entitlement that people feel to telling other people what to do, where they're basically saying, go screw up your own mental health, deplete your bank account just to go prove something to other people. And like that's something that I just really resent, because you don't need to compete to do that. Like that's inherently classist, because it's basically saying that everyone who cannot afford to do that has no value in the horse world to show people other ways of doing things. And that's just simply not true, especially since we have social media now where people can readily watch what other people are doing. Competition does provide another way of doing that, but it's not the only way of doing that. The other thing too is, for me, like if my end goal is to have a farm and be able to just do these behavioral modification rehabs, if that's my life goal and that is what is most important to my heart and that is what I want the most, why would I put money into doing something that would take away from being able to do that and take time away from being able to put in the effort to try to secure enough money to make that happen? It's just it's very short-sighted. And the more I've kind of gotten into advocacy outside of the horse world and seeing what people are justifying outside of the horse world and seeing like how people perceive poor people in general, the more hardcore I've kind of gotten in this. And I've just realized how elitist the community that I've grown up is. Because also it's like when my family lost all their money, like I went from being a priority to from my trainer to just being kind of not considered at all. And I got bullied more too, because I had to lease my horse out part-time instead of just paying for all the expenses myself, and or like my parents paying them. And people were shitty to me because of that. And that's like an example of children participating in classism because it's normalized to them. Like kids don't start out doing these things. And like someone mentioned, like kids start out loving Black Beauty and then like having this really childish like appreciation of horses where they just love horses. And the vast majority of kids, when they start to get into riding, it's not, or like start to get into learning about horses and riding, it's not about riding for them. They would be thrilled to just brush a horse, hang out with them on the ground, and just be around horses. But then they're conditioned to prioritize riding above all else. And it destroys the love that they have for the horse over time and turns it into this love of riding. And a hill that I'll die on is a lot of people who say that they're horse lovers, they've actually gone from being a horse lover to being a lover of riding. Because if you look at their actions and what they say about their priorities, it's very clear that it's not just about the horse. An excellent example of this is people selling their horses once they're too injured or too old to compete at the level that they want, and putting them at risk. Like especially horses that are completely unsound and are not able to be ridden. There's a lot of people who try to offload their unrideable horses, and they'll be like, I can't afford a horse that I can't ride. If they loved the horse more than they loved riding, the horse wouldn't be getting given away as soon as they're not rideable. And that sucks for people to hear. It makes a lot of people furious because they want to deny it. But it's like, that is what your actions say. If it really was about the horse and riding was second to the horse, you would be okay with not riding or changing the way riding looks to you if it meant keeping the horse. Like when my dog blew out both of her knees, I didn't just up and get rid of my dog. If she couldn't go on hikes with me anymore, I wouldn't just offload her to someone else. But with horses, this is normal and acceptable, where people just get rid of their horses when they cannot ride them anymore. And our industry tries to deny what that actually says about us. And I think that it's like we need to be more honest and self-reflective, because a lot of people are in such a cognitive dissonance that they're denying what their actions actually say about them. And I'm saying all this as someone who used to believe in those things. Like, I would have defended tooth and nail the idea of selling a horse when they can no longer help you achieve your competition dreams. I would have defended that tooth and nail and said that it doesn't mean that you don't love the horse, but it does mean that riding is more important than the horse in that context. And it like, we can't just ignore what our actions say about our priorities. And a lot of horse people want to do that. They want it both ways. They want to be viewed as a horse first type person who loves the horse the most, but then they also want to be able to offload horses when they are no longer usable to them without being criticized for it. On the flip side, a lot of these same people, if they watch someone do this to a dog or a cat, they would have a huge issue with it, and they would say it's bad, and they would chastise people. And the irony of this is, like, we see it with a lot of things. A lot of these people who are keeping their horses predominantly in stalls will watch a documentary like Blackfish and they'll feel bad for the whales. Meanwhile, they're keeping their horse in basically an identical setting where their needs are being unmet. They're highly stressed. They're showing signs of stress through abnormal behaviors. And they just hyper normalize it because it's too painful to look at it for what it actually is. And the sad thing is that a lot of people are so used to being around chronically stressed horses that they don't know what regular relaxation and normal behaviors in horses look like. They view stress as the norm, and they start to label stress behaviors as quirks or just being excitement. And that's not what they are. The thing that people hate hearing about horses is that they're flight animals. And what we see with flight animals is that they're energy conservers. When they do have excitable behaviors, it's typically short-lived and not constant. Like, when we see horses constantly engaging in repetitive behaviors again and again and again, especially high energy behaviors like horses bucking, rearing, bolting with a rider on, that's 99% of the time, that's not excitement, unless it's like a very short-lived moment. But we see horses in the show ring doing this even when they have huge bits in their mouth, and it's painful, and they're hitting the end of the bit, and then they keep reacting. And that's because of stress. But people love calling it excitement despite all of the other signs that it is not excitement. And this all goes back to the fact that a lot of these people are so far removed from what is normal horse behavior that they cannot label what is and isn't stress behavior. They don't actually see how horses interact in a herd, how they play with other horses, what excitement actually looks like when it's a herd animal doing it. So they label things within what is most comfortable for them to admit to in their lifestyle, because admitting to things being stressed when they're seeing them happen all the time is painful to do. But yeah, it's very frustrating to see the state of the horse world and to kind of reflect on all these things and make changes, and then like see what people continue to justify and what people normalize. The other thing that I want to note is that there is a lot of like cruelty and mistreatment to people who start to be more critical of the industry. Like, the horse industry kind of operates a little bit like a cult. Where when you start questioning practices, even rightful criticisms, you're not criticizing the entirety of the horse world. You're not criticizing the entirety of a discipline. You're going, hey, like, maybe we shouldn't condone dressage horses being ridden in hyperflexion and winning. And people will be like, oh, so you think the whole sport should be canceled? You hate all horse people? You're saying that all horseback riding is abuse? And they look at it in this black and white way and make this false dichotomy to try to shut you up from talking, because they view any criticism of the sport as an attack on everything. They have no capacity to criticize what's in front of them without viewing it as an all-encompassing attack of all equestrian sports. When really we should be able to criticize practices within the horse sport without it being a statement on every single person with a horse. Like, criticizing specific things that you are seeing is actually a very normal thing to do when you're in the interest of improving the sport that you're in. But in the horse world, we have normalized this attitude where you either have to accept everything that's going on in front of you or be completely against it. And it is so unhealthy. It promotes abuse because it essentially scares people out of criticizing anything because they're treated like shit when they do. And this happens to kids too. When kids start to question things, they are either ridiculed or put into a position where they have to act. Like, I didn't start out wanting to kick or whip or hurt horses, But when I pushed back against it with my trainer, I was told, if you don't do this, this horse is going to react badly with someone else. And if that person gets hurt, it will be your fault. And I'm being told that by an adult when I'm a child. So obviously, I look at what I'm being told by an adult and I go, oh, well, they must be right. I should listen to them. And then over time, it becomes a conditioned behavior where you are just comfortable doing these things that you once questioned. And we see that happening repeatedly in the horse world, because questioning anything risks being excommunicated by the group of people and like the community that you built. Because they attack anything that feels like a threat. And in order to start getting comfortable doing that, you basically have to be comfortable with the idea of potentially losing people in your life and having people no longer like support you because you're questioning the status quo. And that really shouldn't be a thing. Like, we should be having discussions where there is healthy criticism about what's going on in the sport, especially when there's a lot of science that's questioning the ethics of it. But instead, we don't have that. And we also see people just attacking others and looking at it from the standpoint of like, oh, let's see you compete at that level. Unless you compete at that level, you can't judge. What other industry do we justify that in? Like, if a doctor committed malpractice, would you go and tell the person that got injured as a result of that, oh, well, you're not a doctor, you can't criticize? If a chef fed you glass, would you go, oh, I'm not a chef, I can't criticize, this might be proper cooking? No, you don't have to compete at the top level to be able to identify horse behavior. And the other thing that's super hypocritical about this is the logic only applies to people at the top level, and this is where the elitism comes in again. People at the top levels apparently are experts on riding, horse behavior, horse welfare, and equine sciences, despite the fact that virtually none of those riders have any relevant education on horse behavior, welfare, and equine sciences. So we're looking to them as the all-encompassing, all-knowledgeable beings of horses and giving them the benefit of the doubt for everything, even when they are less educated and less credible in those areas. Like, sure, you could argue that, like, okay, I couldn't jump a meter 60 course as well as a Grand Prix jumper, but that is not necessary for commenting on horse stress behavior. Noticing horse stress behavior is about educating yourself on what normal horse behavior is and spending a lot of time watching horses in normal, healthy settings and what a normal, healthy, calm horse looks like. People at the top levels are not doing that. They're not getting these educations. And the reason why you see a lot of these people who are highly educated on horse behavior and horse welfare opting to not compete is because of that. But because of the elitism in the horse world, people at the top of the sport are basically given license to do whatever they want, no matter how unjustifiable, and you cannot criticize them unless you're in the same club. You have to be part of that elite club of being at the top levels in order to criticize anything. And that is so toxic and unhealthy, and it enables and justifies a lot of abuse because people are just mocked and ridiculed for any criticism that they make. Like, it shouldn't be controversial to say, like, hey, like, we shouldn't be condoning horses bleeding in competition, especially when it's the result of the equipment being used or the riders harsh riding. Or we shouldn't be condoning hyperflexion in dressage horses, and it shouldn't be getting high marks when we have all of these studies showing the harm that it caused. None of that should be controversial. The only reason why it is because it's criticizing people who are in the upper echelon of horse industry stuff. And they don't want to be criticized by the little people, the people who are poor and not in their community and crowd. So they've created this cult-like mindset where it's like you can only criticize if you are one of them, which is completely illogical because we're referencing horse behavior. And again, like, if it's about expertise and education and capacity to speak out on certain topics, none of those top level riders are as qualified as equine behaviorists, equine welfare experts, equine scientists, and the people who are actually creating these studies and doing the work to speak on horse behavior. But they are still regarded as experts because if people actually look to the welfare professionals for those concerns, they would have to change what they do. And that's what we're seeing across the industry is people don't want to change. They don't want to change what they do. They don't want to have to change what horsemanship looks like to them. They don't want to have to alter training practices or look critically at things. So they just do whatever they can to justify it. And they mock and attack people who dare to criticize. the vast majority of the time anyone has a rebuttal to what I'm saying, especially if they're in the competitive world, it's comprised of degrading me and personally attacking me. They'll just be like, oh, you're just a nobody. You're just mad because you can't compete at this level. You're a fake trainer. You're shitty, blah, 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 blah. It's all personal attacks. They don't attack the argument, generally speaking, because they can't. They don't have a rebuttal to these criticisms of the sport. So instead, they attack the person. And the thing that I find so ironic about that is it's maintaining this perspective that it's like I'm the only one possessing these opinions on horse welfare, despite the fact that there's lots of very credible people in the science sphere that are experts on horse behavior that are where I'm pulling a lot of this information from. But they attack the person to try to push you into silence. And the other thing is there's this notion and it's like, oh, speaking out doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter. There's no point. But they wouldn't be so scared about these voices talking if they didn't think they had the capacity to ignite change. The reason why we see all these horse people getting so pissed when people question the industry is because they're scared of what that might mean. And honestly, like the funny thing about this whole issue is that like people who want to see horse sports continue should be meeting in the middle and talking to equine welfare experts and be supporting reforms to the industry that are improving horse welfare, because ultimately if the industry gets banned, it's going to be the result of horse people refusing to change anything. And the other thing is that if it does get banned, they're all going to blame the advocates and be like, this is your fault because they refuse to look at the role that they play. By not changing anything and by refuting any consideration for horse welfare and just basically throwing a tantrum when people are like, hey, what if we considered horses more? That is giving animal rights groups more reason to believe that horse people will not change anything and that they do not care. We need to show people that horse people do care and that they're willing to change their practices with more information. But instead of doing that, horse people are doubling down and denying it, and it just makes us all look very bad. Like the amount of people jumping to defend the bloody mouth of the horse in the Melbourne Cup is one thing. Like you can recognize the fact that it might have been a fluke accident while being like, yeah, that's a bad look for the industry. And we shouldn't be normalizing that. We shouldn't be comfortable interviewing someone while their horse bleeds from the mouth and acting like nothing's happening. Like it makes us look bad. And it literally just starts with like making any effort to consider horses more and improve horse welfare. But a lot of people do not want to do that. They want to be able to do whatever they want with horses. And they want to be able to never be criticized or have any of this stuff pointed out. And it's going to end up resulting in the industry crashing because we're already seeing more and more people question practices from within the industry, but also outside of it. Speaking from experience, people who aren't horse people are often more adept at recognizing stress behaviors in horses than horse people are because they haven't been indoctrinated to view things that are not normal behaviors as normal behaviors or like quirks and excitement. They often notice things that horse people are willing to overlook, even though they have no horse experience because it's intuitive. And it's the same thing with a lot of horse people when they're just starting out in the industry. They question things that they eventually learn to just ignore and condone. So it speaks volumes for the amount of conditioning that's involved in helping horse people be willing to overlook a lot of these welfare issues. And I just think that like people need to be more reflective and honest. And I also think that we need to recognize the role that like elitism and classism plays, especially at the upper levels of sport, because a lot of the justifications we see about why the horses are not being poorly cared for is rooted in like just basically being like, look at how much money is spent on them. But the amount of money you spend on a horse means nothing if you're not meeting their species appropriate needs. Like horses are social animals. And people hate when I say this, but it's like it is damaging to their welfare to keep them isolated. It is damaging to their welfare to keep them in such small areas that they can't wander around and do things. I know that that's hard to hear, especially for people who feel trapped and like they cannot provide that. But it's the truth. And ignoring that and denying it does not change the experience for your horse. They are social herd animals. They are farm animals. Look at other farm animals that and how they're kept. Like even factory farmed animals like cattle, they are kept in groups. They typically have free choice access to forage. and they have more space to move around than the average competition horse does. And this is not me condoning factory farming, it's just drawing a comparison with an industry that a lot of people will criticize the ethics of, and rightfully so. Meanwhile, they protect another industry that has similarly poor practices. And I don't think it's any more justifiable to keep an animal in really negative circumstances where their needs aren't met just because they're living for longer. If anything, it's just a life where they're extending the like lack of needs being met and just living in subpar conditions. But it's something that I found really interesting because one of my friends is studying like their masters of animal behavior, and they work at like there's the university that she's at has like a dairy farm. So I've gotten to go there and see the way that they do things, and there's a lot of stuff that is definitely not okay. But ironically, a lot of the things that people would criticize, like horses, are either being treated the same way or oftentimes worse. So of course, like the weaning of baby cat like calves from dairy cows, they're weaned like pretty much right away. Like basically when they hit the ground, they're separated from their moms, and they're not there. There's very little time spent with the mom, which is not okay. It's traumatic. They're removing them from their mom, and it's like, and then they're going alone for a little bit in quarantine before they're put out with other calves, which is really damaging to a social animal. However, there's been studies that they've done on dairy cows that have found like the longer you leave a calf with their mom to bond, the more stressful leaving that situation is, which behaviorally makes sense to me because when they've barely existed in the world and you remove them, they wouldn't know the difference. Again, not condoning it, just talking about the realities of the stress that it imposes. But with horses, we do cold turkey weaning all the time. A lot of breeding farms just remove the babies from their mom one day after they've only known being by her side for like 3 to 6 months, and they just cold turkey wean them, and they're very stressed and they're panicking and they're pacing. Like I remember at one of the old barns that I was at, they weaned this filly cold turkey, put her in an isolation paddock where she had no other contact with horses, could not touch them, could not do anything. She paced all night until she was fucking lathered because she went from always being with her mom to being completely fucking alone. And like that's just one example of cold turkey weaning. A lot of farms do this. There are ways to wean more ethically, of course, but it's not happening across the industry. And then the other thing is when you look at how the average competition horse is kept, a lot of them don't get free choice hay. A lot of them are kept isolated and alone in very small spaces that they don't have a lot of space to move around, and they don't have a lot of species appropriate needs met. Whereas it's basically unheard of to see people keeping cattle in isolation, regardless of what they're used for. Like if they're used in the food industry for whatever reason, they are usually kept in herds, and they are usually having free choice access to forage. So they have their social needs met to a higher standard than the average competition horse does. And they also have their species appropriate needs of like needing to constantly be consuming forage met to a greater extent than a lot of horses have. And that's an industry that people will more readily criticize when they want to look the other way from the horse industry. So it begs the question of why are we so comfortable criticizing other industries that we are not a part of about things that we condone when they happen to horses? Horses are really the only farm animal I can think of where it's very normalized to just basically keep them indoors the vast majority of their daily time budget and keep them alone. What other farm animal can you think of that happens with? Because like I can't think of one, and I've been looking, like even in the most subpar feedlot conditions, these animals that are social are usually kept in social groups. We don't see that happening with these horses at the top levels that are getting the best of the best care. So the other thing is that like we already have so much research on how damaging excessive stalling is. Like race horses are one of the most studied types of horse for this thing because they're commonly kept stalled in North America, where they're isolated and stalled for the vast majority of the time, because most of these racetracks do not have any type of turnout situation. And like the amount of stress behaviors that you see in those horses is insane. And the difference in behavior when you pull them out of that situation and then offer them a species appropriate lifestyle is insane. It's like a complete 180 pivot. Like the entire stereotype of thoroughbreds being crazy, I think, stems from the fact that they don't have their needs met. And a lot of people pull them out of the racetrack setting and then don't meet their needs adequately. And then they see these stress behaviors that manifest as a result. every single off the track thoroughbred I have had, which is lots, when you give them social herd turnout and space to move around and adequate hay, and you give them downtime, they turn into a very easy to handle horse, and they become like completely different than what you would have known them to be at the racetrack. And it's because their behavior, their problem behaviors, are manifesting from stress. But our industry is still in denial of that, and they'd rather paint horses as just being quirky, or like use stereotypes like, oh, just a typical thoroughbred, or just a red-headed mare, or she's just being a mare. And it's like, no, that horse is stressed. It's not because of her fucking gender. Also, that in itself is misogynistic, to try to suggest that like female animals are more likely to engage in these problem behaviors. There's actually a study that they've done with horses on that, and there was no difference found between mares and geldings, other than geldings having slightly more objectionable behaviors than mares. So they actually had more problems with geldings than mares. But people are more likely to see a mare do something that they don't want to do and then blame it on her gender. So yeah, anyways, it's very frustrating to me to see all that stuff happening. And like, that's also the other component of competition, is like being in that environment and seeing it all the time is very toxic and taxing on your mental health when you see it for what it is. Because you can't just walk up to everybody and start lecturing them on their care and their practices and calling them out, because it's, one, not going to change anything. Two, it's going to start a huge fight, and it's going to isolate you more from that group. So essentially, going to these types of things is just immersing yourself in an environment where you're seeing a lot of stress and mistreatment and toxicity and not being able to do anything about it. And it's like very unhealthy. And I've already done that before, because when I was galloping racehorses, for most of the time I was doing that, I was galloping at the farm, which was like way better for the horses' welfare, because they had like turnout and they were living a lower stress life, and it wasn't 24/7 stalling. So the difference in the behaviors of the horses there was very substantial. And then there was one year where I worked at the racetrack for the season, and I literally, like, my mental health was terrible, because it was really hard being in that environment. And I maintain that perspective of like, oh, well, at least like I'll be more understanding to these horses and like treat them nicer and like ride them nicer and not get after them or punish them for stress behaviors, because I understand why they're behaving this way. And I told myself that, like, bring change from within, right? Like, show people the right way to do things. And I even got some trainers to start clicker training and using positive reinforcement, which is great. But it tanked my mental health, and it did not bring the level of change that you would want to see. And it was just really toxic, because you're also putting yourself more in danger by handling horses who are chronically stressed and not being able to address the factors that are leading to these problem behaviors in full or at all, because it's largely from the isolation and the stalling and the confinement. So it's just not healthy. And I think that the idea of like people immersing themselves in toxic environments for the sake of trying to change them from within is inherently flawed, because it hasn't been happening. And it's just encouraging people to dive into an environment that's not serving them anymore. And I mean, for people who want to show, and for people who believe in that, like, all the power to them if they want to bring change that way. But the idea that that's the only way to do things, and this fixation on showing, pisses me off. And it's also just like very elitist, like, honestly. And I don't see like anyone stepping up to like offer to sponsor people who will show in a more ethical way and cover the fees. So it's like, who wants to pay $2,000 to go into an environment that makes them feel shitty and stresses them out and is probably going to be stressful to their horse? Not me. So what I want to do is like start trail riding more and going to beautiful locations and getting to go through lovely mountainous trails and doing stuff like that, because like that's what makes me happy. So that's the end goal, and that's like doing what makes you happy and what I think my horses will like the most, because that would be fun. So that's the end goal for me. And it's also just a lot more accessible, and like all of the people I've met that have done that have treated me a lot nicer and have been easier to get along with also. But I encourage people to like reflect on their privilege, because it's not normal to be able to compete to that extent that a lot of people who show a lot do, and to have the funds to do so. with very little in return. Like that is an example of extreme privilege, and it's not the norm, and it's not accessible. And like I think people love tokenizing the very few riders that come from backgrounds where they're poor and they manage to make it to the top, and they love bringing up those select few riders, but they don't speak for the vast majority of people. And if you look at the people who come from poorer backgrounds that end at the top, they have had to drink the Kool-Aid to a certain extent in order to get accepted into that crowd of people. So they've had to sacrifice their horsemanship in a lot of ways in order to get accepted into that crowd and to get the opportunities that they do. But overwhelmingly, the people we see that are seeing the most success at the top levels are from very wealthy backgrounds and have grown up in wealth. And I think that that is part of the problem, because it just creates this mindset that overlooks a lot of the problems that the horses are facing. Anyways, that's my thoughts. So thank you for listening, everybody, because classism and elitism are so present in the horse world, and they contribute to a lot of mistreatment of horses. And that's just a fact. And I wish more people would acknowledge that. And I also wish that people who benefit from that would be willing to reflect inward and like see the privileges that they have that other people don't, instead of getting hyper defensive and going, I work really hard. So it's like, no one's saying that you haven't worked for what you have. We're saying that you haven't had the same obstacles as other people. And like, they don't even realize the things that they've had that have made their lives easier. Because like I've grown up around these people, and their version of working hard for what they have is like going to competitions and doing their lessons, and like maybe having a part-time job. But honestly, a lot of the people that showed the most didn't have to work. Their parents paid for their car, they paid for their insurance, they paid for their gas, they paid for their show fees. And it's like, okay, you're working hard to become a better rider, but you don't have to do all of these other things in addition to that. When you're working a full-time job or a part-time job, paying for all your other expenses in addition to having to work towards those competitive show goals, it takes a lot of time away from being able to focus on just showing. And it adds a bunch of stressors. And that's just a reality. And I wish more people would be willing to look at that, because it would provide more understanding. And I'd love to see like a role reversal where some of these people who haven't had to face those challenges are placed in situations where they have to account for that, so they can see how hard it is to navigate. Because yeah, when I was competing, like I literally would go to work in the morning at the racetrack, and I would work until like 8 or 9, and then I'd rush over to the horse shows, and I'd have to get my horse tacked and have like way less time to warm up and get ready. And then go into the show ring. And like similarly, when I was going to university, I would go get up early in the morning. I would gallop first, and then I would change in my car in the university parking lot, and then go to class. And it was exhausting. And like I'm still recovering from the burnout and like the toll that it took on my body. And it's just like all of those things in conjunction with one another create a lot of challenges. And it makes it a lot less enjoyable to engage in an environment that might be more fun for people who aren't having to do all those things at once. And just something to consider. Anyways, thanks for listening. For anyone who's interested in more of these lives, I've just opened up my memberships on YouTube, and I'm posting behind the scenes stuff and more stuff that's not going on my main feed, because I just have a lot of videos that I've accumulated recently and over the last year or two that I just haven't shown. So it's going to be more stuff that doesn't necessarily make it to the main feed, and I'm going to be putting it on memberships, and that's just a way to support me if you're interested. But either way, it's like I still will be posting free content and stuff. So just plugging that for myself. And yeah, thank you for watching, and have a great day, everybody.